thought you just did it.
I don't.
Okay.
Is it filming?
Yeah.
So,
Hey, professors.
in Benjamin Cardozo's The Nature of Judicial Process, the first method is the method of philosophy, which in there he states, our thoughts and actions are shaped by inherited instincts, traditional beliefs, and acquired convictions. Because of this, there is no true objectivity. And from this method of philosophy comes precedents and traditions.
Cardozo's second method is on history and tradition. History is used by the judge to base their decisions off the origin of the law and to make the logic of the law clear. The reason this method is also about traditions is because laws were already made the way they were for a reason, and the laws should be applied the way they were through history. The laws should not be changed if anything, they should only be enhanced and built upon.
The third method that Cardozo discussed is known as sociology, the judge as a legislature. This method explains to the reader that the judge presiding over a case upholds the duty to abide by all the philosophies that can construct and support the common law. When determining what is constitutionally right or wrong, the judge must remain purely objective, and if he or she maintains a bias, they must remove themselves from that particular case, as they would not be fit to serve the public and the defendant fairly. Cardozo also states that the presiding judge must announce all emotion, support, or prejudice that could waver the judge and their opinion. If these arise, again, the judge must immediately remove themselves from overseeing the case. This method supports that the judge's sole purpose is to always maintain the safety of the public and to ensure that each case uses logic, history, custom, utility, and accepted standards as it reaches its conclusion. The judge then makes a determination as to which of the above applies most efficiently. Above all else, the judge's job is to oversee that the law, in all instances, is being adhered to, and if any gaps or questions arise, he must again use logic, history, custom, utility, and accepted standards to continue the successful completion of the case. Lastly, this method states that it is not the judge's job to determine guilt or innocence, but rather to maintain that the defendant's rights are supported and defended.
The last method is adherence to precedent, the subconscious element in the judicial process. Cardozo emphasizes on the importance of precedents that they should have in court. There are two types of precedents. First is static. Static precedent is a non-important precedent that does not affect jurisprudence. And then there's the dynamic precedent, that is one that will affect jurisprudence. Cardozo says that adherence to precedent should be the rule and not the exception, and also that this method should be rigid, but also should not be so flexible that any judge can easily rely on it whenever. What Cardozo wants is consistency.
In the Supreme Court case, Roe v. Wade, the majority voted based on support from Cardozo's third method. This case argued against the current constitutional abortion laws in 1973 in the defense of saving a pregnant mother's life. A 21-year-old woman in Texas attempted to get an abortion under the circumstance that she was raped, which was false, but the only way she could have received a legal abortion. After finding no police report of this alleged crime, the woman was charged with the attempt of an illegal abortion. A pair of women's advocacy attorneys took on her case and gave her the name Jane Roe to protect her identity. Roe's attorneys argued that specific rights had been violated that weren't listed in other parts of the Constitution. The Supreme Court decided that the right to privacy, whether in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty and restrictions upon the state action, as the district court determined in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Justice Harry Blackmun supported Cardozo's third method when supporting the majority vote in Roe v. Wade by not only maintaining the defendant's protection under the 14th Amendment by ensuring the protection of her rights against the state and the prohibition of the state from interfering with her privileges as a citizen, but he also defends her 9th Amendment right. As a citizen of the United States, the young woman was entitled to rights that aren't necessarily written word for word in the amendments, but rather are implied in the language, history, and structure of the Constitution. And Justice Blackmun supports and defends all of the young woman's rights, written or non-written, which ethically follows Benjamin Cardozo's third method.
The case of Bowers versus Hardwick is about a man named Michael Hardwick who the police were looking for and found him in his own home. When they found him in his own home, they saw that he was violating the Georgia statute on sodomy. It was challenged because it was consensual. The court ruled that it violated the statute on homosexual sodomy. When it comes to the right to privacy, Blackmun dissents on this case by using the method of sociology. Because what a person does in their own home has a right to privacy and does not affect the society outside of the home and their well-being, especially when the act was consensual.
A case in which adherence to precedent was denounced was Obergefell vs. Hodges. This 2015 landmark case ruled 5-4 that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. Supreme Court Justices Thomas, Alito, Roberts, and Scalia were the minority. Judge Thomas goes to say that it is dangerous to treat due process as a substantive right, as well as the 14th Amendment, causing issues because it causes judges to be guided by their personal views and not fundamental rights. Then Justice Alito's dissent, he says that there is nothing in the Constitution that brings up a right for same-sex marriage. This is true and backed up by the 10th Amendment, saying that powers not delegated by the Constitution are reserved by the states and or to the people. Chief Justice Roberts' dissent, he argues that judges under the Constitution have the power to say what the law is and not what it should be. This is very similar to Justice Alito's point. Roberts also says that the argument of same-sex marriage is compelling, but the fundamental right to marry cannot make a state change its definition of what marriage actually is. He also says that the majority's decision was based on will and not legality. Last is Justice Scalia. She brings up the Declaration of Independence and says that constitutional revision would rob the people of the most important liberty, which is the freedom to govern themselves.
In the 1919 case, Debs versus U.S., Eugene Debs was believed to be guilty of obstructing military recruiting and enlistment through an anti-war speech. Also in 1919 was the case of Schenck versus U.S., where Charles Schenck, like Debs, was guilty of obstructing recruiting and enlistment, but in his case through the printing and circulation of leaflets. In both cases, the majority opinion upheld the convictions. Both were written out by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now in 1925 was the case of Gitlow versus New York. Benjamin Gitlow was convicted for violating the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 by publishing the left-wing manifesto in a newspaper. The majority upheld Gitlow's conviction under the belief that the government has the right to punish and suppress speech that directly advocates for the unlawful overthrow of the U.S. government by force and violence. However, in this case, Holmes dissents. Unlike Debs and Schenck, he believed there was no clear and present danger. Debs and Schenck provided a call to action, whereas Gitlow was more of a social analysis. The overlying theme between all three cases was the absence or the presence of a clear and present danger.
Okay, bye.